Hello, and welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and today we're going to discuss an incredibly sad and brutal case. We're going to discuss the Leicester Street murders. I typically only put trigger warnings at the top of the episode when there's something particularly tough that I'll be talking about, and this case is no exception of that. This is a mass murder. There's a lot that happens in this case. So there's no hard feelings if you guys want to only listen to the first little bit of this episode and choose to move on. That's absolutely fine. I hope that you come back for our next episode or listen to one of our old ones. But if you're willing to stick around, let's go ahead and jump right into this case. On March 3rd, 2008, Officer Randall Davis was called to 722 Leicester Street in Memphis, Tennessee for a wellness check. A woman named Mrs. Smith requested the wellness check after she was unable to get a hold of her child's father for over 24 hours. Mrs. Smith had gone to 722 Leicester Street herself and saw that the front door was partially open, but when knocking on the storm door, no one came to the door to greet her. So she stood around for just about a moment. She could hear that the radio was on, and through that partially open door, she could see that the TV was in the living room. There were photos on the wall. So the house was occupied, but no one was coming to the door. She decided to not go further into the home since it was not hers. And after expressing her worry and consulting with some family members, she decided to call the police for a wellness check. Officer Davis approached the home, and similar to as Miss Smith had observed, the door to the home was open, but the outer storm door was closed. And the Officer Davis opened the door a little bit further, stepped inside, and he recalled that he could immediately, upon entry, smell the dead bodies. And with a couple of steps into the home, he was able to see a person's foot on the floor. He quickly discovered 4 adults in the living room who had been shot multiple times. With no signs of life, Officer Davis kept moving throughout the house. Davis, along with 2 other officers, began to search the home for additional victims and or the perpetrator. As he entered the bathroom in the hallway, he discovered another victim, a 9-year-old boy that had a 4-inch blade that had been left in his head. Similar to the 4 victims already found in the home, Davis believed that this young victim was dead due to his obvious wounds, but then he noticed eye movement. Officer Davis alerted the other officers that there was a 5th victim that was alive and in need of immediate medical attention. Officer Davis then continued to search the home. In one of the bedrooms, he found a 4-year-old boy who was deceased. In a second bedroom, he found a 2-year-old boy and a 5-year-old boy who both had appeared to be dead. And lastly, he found a 2-month-old girl who was still alive. He picked up the baby girl and carried her out of the home. And while he was walking out, the fire department were arriving on scene and walking into the home. Officer Davis instructed them to go to the boy for immediate treatment and for some of the medical team from the fire department to begin checking vitals for the 4 adults in the living room and the other children in the 2 bedrooms. The medical team that was helping the 9-year-old boy in the bathroom noticed that he had multiple cuts on his face and neck, a stab wound to his stomach, in addition to the blade that was sticking out of his head, which was described as a sawzall blade. The medical team determined that the 4-year-old boy in the first bedroom and the 2-year-old boy in the second bedroom were both pronounced dead on the scene. But in addition to the baby that Officer Davis had carried out of the home, the 5-year-old boy in the second bedroom was also still alive. So we have 3 surviving victims, all children that were taken to the hospital. So I kind of want to take a brief recap on our victims because it's very shocking and there's many victims here. We're talking about 4 murdered adults, 2 murdered children, and 3 surviving children. 9 victims violently attacked in a small home in Memphis, Tennessee, and all the victims knew each other. Most of them were related. And I'm going to do my best when it comes to names here because there are a lot of names, a lot of similar names or the same names, a lot of generations. Um, so, first, the 4 adults that we have in the living room. We have 30-year-old Cecil Dotson Sr., who is the one who leased the home. Cecil Sr.'s girlfriend, 27-year-old Marissa Williams. A friend of the couple, 33-year-old Hollis Seals. And another friend, 22-year-old Shindri Robertson. The 9-year-old boy who was found alive in the bathroom was Cecil Jr. Dotson. We'll call him CJ, and he is the son of Cecil Sr. The 4 other victims were all children of Cecil Sr. and Marissa. Camario Dotson was the 4-year-old boy that was found in the first bedroom. The 2-year-old found in the second bedroom was Cecil Dotson II. The 2-month-old baby was Sanaya Dotson, and the 5-year-old boy was Cedric Dotson. So after the surviving victims were taken to the hospital, the crime scene investigation began. And one of the first things investigators noticed was blood on the victims was dry, indicating that it had been some time since the murders had occurred. This led to the question of when did this attack happen and how long were the survivors in the home after being attacked? Pretty quickly, investigators put the 3 surviving children into protective custody and wouldn't allow any of the extended family members to see them. They didn't want to release their names to the press, and anyone who had contact with the children had to be approved by the Memphis Police Department Deputy Director Tony Armstrong. Even medical personnel had to go through this approval process. And while investigating the scene, officers found spent bullet casings all over the living room. Multiple on the sofa, between the cushions, in the arm, on the wall behind the sofa, and then there was some in the air conditioner, kind of on the walls around the room. And these casings were both 9mm and 38 caliber. And it was clear that 2 guns were used. And then underneath a jacket in the living room, they found a Ziploc plastic bag that had 16 more casings in it from these two different styles of bullets. And it was as if someone was starting to try to collect them and clean up the scene a bit and either got scared and fled, got sidetracked, or as I think we'll see in this case, realized that they weren't actually going to be able to clean up the scene. Detectives believe that the adult victims were staged. And well, I'm going to keep how the kids were murdered and injured brief. I do think that there are some details with the injuries with the adults that provide some valuable information in this case. Cecil Sr. died from multiple gunshot wounds, 1 to the head, 1 to the neck, 1 to the cheek, 1 to the right leg, and 4 to the left leg. He was found on his knees facing the couch, and his body was leaning forward onto the cushions. And in his left hand, there was a bag of marijuana. With the multiple gunshot wounds to the front of his body, it wouldn't make sense for him to be facing the couch on his knees and leaning forward. The trajectory of those bullets does not make sense for that position. So it is believed that his body was moved after he was shot, and the bag of marijuana that was found in his hand was apparently large enough that he likely would not have been able to keep his hand clasped around it after he was shot. It likely would have been a muscle reaction and dropped because there was enough weight in the bag to not have it sit in his hand any longer. Shindri was shot 4 times. 3 times in her left leg and 1 in her right. She was found sitting on the floor with her back leaning against the couch and her legs straight out in front of her. Her shirt was pulled up, exposing her breasts, and her pants were pulled down to her knees. On her exposed lap was a clear plastic bag that had 3 to 5 crack cocaine rocks in it. And due to the blood around her and her clothing, detectives believed that she was moved to the floor from the couch after her death. And the bullet holes in her pants showed that she was wearing her pants at the time of the shooting. Marissa was shot 5 times, once in the head, once in the chest, once in the abdomen, once in the right leg, and once in the left leg. And she was found sitting on the floor next to Shindri with her torso kind of leaning on Shindri, and Marissa's legs were crossed over on top of Shindri's legs, indicating that Marissa had been staged after Shindri. Also, the blood on the floor indicated that Marissa would have originally been leaning in the other direction from how she was found. Again, just indicating that she was moved after she was shot. And then lastly, Hollis was shot 3 times, once in the mouth and 2 in the chest. He was found in the living room, kind of right next to the door to the kitchen, and his pants had been pulled down to his knees, and bloodstains on his body indicate that his body had also been moved, likely rolled over in an attempt to pull down his pants. And I don't want to get into the specifics with the kids. I know we just went into some there, and honestly, there's a whole lot more I could talk about with the adults. But this is a very brutal case. So if I can bring a little bit of levity to it and not talk about those details, I'm going to choose to do that. And most specifically, when it comes to the kids, I don't want to get into details, but I will give kind of just a blanket statement. Cecil Dotson II and Kamario Dotson were attacked using knives from the home and a wooden board also from the home. And similar to the bullet casings that were collected by the murderer but still left in the home, the handles of the knives had actually been removed and hidden around the bedrooms. One blade was found in a pillowcase, another was found between a mattress and a wall. And one thing that is noted in the official documents at this point is that the majority of the windows of the home were covered by bars. Um, and that's just to kind of give you a little bit of sense of this area. 722 Leicester Street is in Binghamton neighborhood of Memphis. And according to neighborhoodscout.com, the area around 722 Leicester Street is rated as one of the most dangerous areas in Memphis and considered one of the lowest income neighborhoods in the United States. All of the staging in this case and in this scene indicates the suspect or suspects spent a considerable amount of time in the home after the murders. And while the evidence, like the bullet casings and the dismantled knives, were left behind, the 2 guns that were used in the home were not left. And this led detectives to believe that the suspect or suspects were comfortable with the home and didn't feel the need to rush out, and potentially provided their own weapons to commit the murder, at least minimally the guns. And given the sheer violence involved in the 6 murders and 3 additional attempted murders, and given the fact that Binghamton's violent crime reputation and gang violence in the area, it's understandable that the immediate thought for these murders, for both detectives and for just locals in the media, was that this might be a gang retaliation of some sort. But detectives fairly quickly moved past this idea due to the amount of time that the suspect or suspects spent in the house after the murders. While it couldn't be fully ruled out, it's likely that a gang murder suspect or suspects wouldn't stick around. That's a really big risk for them to be caught. In addition to the risk of them sticking around, investigators from their experience hadn't seen gang retaliations to be kind of this volume and include women and children. Usually it's one or two people that are directly involved, but it doesn't typically go beyond that, especially when women or children are involved. And this is based off of their experience, which I feel like, at least in pop culture and the news, is something that I've heard the same. I obviously know basically nothing about gangs and gang life, but I feel like that's kind of fairly common knowledge. So investigators felt like they really needed to start looking at people who knew the family. So once the home was processed by crime scene investigators, detectives began to canvass the area and talk with any extended family or neighbors of the victims. The mother of Marissa Williams was one of the first to bring forward a potential suspect. She said that Marissa and Cecil Sr. had been having issues with Mrs. Smith. She is the mother of one of Cecil Sr.'s children, and she's also the one who called in the wellness check. She's the one who showed up at the house, saw that the door was open, and didn't feel right about it. And all of her statements had been verified, and it was fairly quickly proven that she was not involved. The next person that investigators began to look into was Cecil Sr.'s brother, Jesse Dotson Jr. Jesse Jr. said that on March 1st, he was hanging out with Cecil Sr., William Waddell, who was his half brother, and Jesse Jr. and Cecil Sr.'s father, Jesse Dotson Sr. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to keep all of these names straight because there's a lot of different generations of the same name. So I hope you're all with me here. The group that had intended on watching a college basketball game that day at Cecil Sr.'s home. But unfortunately, this TV was having some issues and it was unable to broadcast the game. So after it was discovered that they're not able to watch this game, it sounds like Jesse Sr., the father, and potentially William Waddell left. So it is Jesse Jr. staying at Cecil Sr.'s house for the rest of the afternoon, evening. I'm not entirely sure what time this game was, but I want to say it was late afternoon. Um, but then also at the home was Marissa Williams, and her 5 children, her and Cecil's 5 children. And later that evening, Hollis Seals arrived, and sometime between 10 p.m. and 10:30 that night, Cecil Sr., Jesse Jr., and Hollis left the home to go purchase some marijuana. They first stopped an apartment of someone who they referred to as Frank, and while waiting for Hollis, who had gone into the apartment, Cecil Sr. and Jesse stayed in the car. And according to Jesse, at this point, they saw a man that had a light complexion and wore glasses in the parking lot. And Cecil Sr. got out of the car and spent some time chatting with this guy. He says that they left about 30 minutes later to pick up Hollis's girlfriend, Shindri, and that they went to another apartment to then purchase the marijuana. So I don't know what they were doing at Frank's place. I don't know why Hollis went in there alone. I first thought that was where they were going to go pick up the marijuana, but according to official court documents, this second stop that night was to pick it up. So they pick up the marijuana, and after that, they go to Jesse Jr.'s kids. But I guess they weren't there. I don't know exactly where this was, or why he was picking up. But apparently, wherever he had gone, thinking he was picking up his kids, they weren't there. And after that, Jesse says that he went to his girlfriend's apartment, and this was around 2 to 2:15 in the morning. And this is when he separated from the group. Jesse Jr. went to say that once he got to his girlfriend's home, she wasn't there. She was at work, but her teenage daughter was there. And it sounds like her daughter was not a fan of Jesse Jr., because they got into an argument about him being alone with her. Sounds like she had previously been vocal about not wanting to be alone with him. I don't know a whole lot of details about that, but supposedly this was an ongoing conversation or argument that was being had with her mom, Jesse's girlfriend, and Jesse. And at this point, the investigation, it is believed that this would have been the last time anyone had seen Cecil Sr. and the other victims alive when Jesse separated from this group. And when Jesse was asked if his brother had any enemies, he said that Cecil Sr. had recently had an incident with a member of the Gangster Disciples. And Cecil Sr. was supposedly a member of the Gangster Disciples himself. And about 2 weeks before the murders, Cecil Sr. and Miss Smith were hanging out at a club with some friends. And after the club, they returned to a friend's apartment. And something happened in this apartment where Cecil Sr. ended up slapping Miss Smith. And one of the friends that they were with ended up calling the police over this incident. And once the police arrived, Cecil Sr. told them that the friend, one of which was supposedly also a member of Gangster Disciples, had drugs in their apartment. And one of the most, I think, well respected rules in gangs, at least that seems to be kind of publicly known, is that you don't rat on your other gang members. And him saying that this person had drugs was supposedly a clear violation of this like ground rule within the gang. And that potentially could lead to some retaliation from the gang itself. And as I mentioned earlier, up until this point, investigators didn't believe that this was really a possibility based on their experience with gang crimes in the area. And they really just didn't see retaliation as a motive because of the women and children that were involved in the murders and who had been murdered and attacked. Um, so just to make sure all avenues were investigated, this claim involving the Gangster Disciples was looked into, and one of the investigators interviewed someone who had claimed that Cecil Sr. had stolen $300,000 of drug money from the gang. And another confidential informant had told investigators that Cecil Sr. had stolen $50,000 from Doc Holliday, who this was kind of hard to research, probably for a reason, but from my understanding, Doc Holliday is kind of a code name for the leader of the Gangster Disciples, at least in the Memphis area. I don't really know much beyond that because when you try to look it up, you just find the real Doc Holliday from the 1880s in the Wild West. So I don't really know a whole lot about that, but we're having a couple different sources here saying that Cecil had indeed stolen a lot of money and potentially was on the bad side of the Gangster Disciples. And as the investigation continued on March 4th or 5th, the Gangster Disciples had heard that the police were investigating them, and they were pretty angry to hear about this. And they didn't want to be associated with murdering women and children. And so they went to Nicole's home, and Nicole is Cecil Sr. and Jesse Jr.'s sister. So obviously direct relative. And Jesse Jr. was actually living with Nicole at the time. And they went and kicked in her door. And this was believed to be a message saying, "Stop telling lies." We don't have that for sure. And like confidently, that's what happened, but seems pretty likely. And so Nicole obviously went to the police and she moved her whole family into her cousin's home. And this obviously included Jesse Jr. because he was living with her at the time. And the police arranged to have a marked car sit outside of the home as protection for the family. And when Jesse Jr. came back to the home later, he saw this marked police car outside the apartment and immediately became frantic. He went inside and started saying that the police were there to get him and that he was going to be pinned for these murders. And he grabbed a gun and pointed it at his own head. At this point, Jesse Jr.'s cousin, the person who owned the apartment that they were all staying at, went out to go talk to the police and tell them that if they entered the apartment, Jesse Jr. was threatening to kill himself. So one of the officers asked the cousin to call Jesse Jr. and a conversation that lasted, it says about 5 to 7 minutes. Um, in that conversation, they were able to calm Jesse Jr. down enough for officers to enter the apartment and retrieve the handgun. And during that phone call, and even after the phone call, and when they entered the apartment, Jesse Jr. kept saying that everyone thinks he did it and it's all over the news. And officers told him that they weren't there to arrest him, but they were there to protect him and his family. And at this point they decided that they were just going to move the family to a safe house and they would be completely under police protective custody. And as detectives spoke with the family and detectives were looking into this gang connection, doctors were doing everything that they could for the three kids who survived the attack. The oldest, CJ, suffered numerous injuries, including being found with a blade in his head. And again, I'm not going to go into depth in it, but CJ was conscious when he was taken to the hospital. But doctors really had to act fast to make sure to save his life, to do what they could for him, along with the lives of his siblings. And all three kids underwent surgery on March 3rd. And their doctors said that none of them would have survived without medical intervention. And 2 days after the surgery, detectives would question CJ. They would try to just get a sense of what happened from his point of view as a survivor. And at this point, CJ really he wasn't out of the water. His life was still very much in danger due to the injuries that he had suffered. So detectives really felt they had to move quickly. But unfortunately, this interview didn't yield any information. CJ was in and out of consciousness and was yelling out names of family members who had clear alibis and weren't involved. At this point, he wasn't in the right state of mind. And then 2 days later, police received a phone call from one of CJ's nurses saying that CJ was awake and rational. And if the police wanted to talk to him, they needed to come right away to have that conversation. And when investigators were able to sit down with CJ, he was very clear about what he remembered. He said that Uncle Junior was the one who killed his parents, their friends, and his siblings. And Uncle Junior is Jesse Dotson Jr. So the police went to the safe house to arrest Jesse Jr. After arresting him and reading him his rights, they asked him if he had any gang affiliation. He said that when he was in prison, he was a Crip. And let's just get into a little bit of why he was in prison previously. And he spent a lot of time in prison. When he was 20 years old, he was arrested for murdering a man named Haley Ralph Cox and stealing $20 from his dead body. Jesse Jr. pled guilty in that case so that he could receive a deal, and he received 20 years for the murder with the possibility of parole after 5 years. But he wouldn't get parole right away. He would stay in prison for 14 years before being paroled, and he was released less than a year before the Leicester Street murders. And after being released from prison, he went to go live with his sister, which is why the gangster disciples potentially broke down her door versus anyone else in the family, because he was there and he was the one who was really kind of guiding the police down that thought process. So let's get back to the police interview with Jesse Jr. after he was arrested. He was clearly shaken up after being arrested, as we kind of saw with him just seeing the police car out in front of the home. But detectives were starting to ask broad questions. They asked if he believed in heaven or hell, and even his responses to those questions made detectives believe that he was really struggling to maintain composure during the interview. Eventually, detectives asked if him or anyone else in his family would be referred to as Junior, especially because there are clearly so many different generations with the same name. It would be logical that at least one of them would be referred to as Junior, whether it's Jesse or not. But he didn't say that him or anyone else specifically went by that nickname. But he did kind of throw something else into that conversation, saying that he looked very different from the other members of his family, and he was never really confused with other family members. So this gave CJ's statement more weight and saying that this identifying Jesse Jr. as the murderer and the fact that he looks like no one else, it's less likely that CJ would have been confused over who he saw in that moment. So detectives asked a little more specifically, basically the same question. They asked him if there was a family member that would be referred to as Junior to others, if it was him or it could be someone else. They basically gave him a two option answer. Um, and Jesse's response was that they would be referring to him and not anyone else. So even though he might not go by the name Junior, it seems pretty clear that his family would call him that. And after investigators were able to establish from Jesse Jr. that he was called Junior and that he didn't typically get confused with any other family members, they played the audio of CJ saying that Uncle Junior was the one who had killed six people in that home and injured himself and two of his siblings. So Jesse Jr. was at the point on the verge of a breakdown hearing this, and he told investigators that he and his brother Cecil had gotten into a fight while they were out of the house that evening, and that the fight continued after they had gotten home. And at one point, Cecil Sr. reached for his shotgun, which this is something I didn't mention in the scene earlier. The shotgun was found. It was loaded, it was found on top of a laundry basket, and it had blood of one of the children on it. And from what I saw, this gun was not fired. It had at some point been moved after the attack. That's how the blood would have gotten on it because that victim was in a different room. And there were no signs that that victim was not in that room the whole time. But according to Jesse Jr., Cecil Sr. grabbed the shotgun, but Jesse Jr. was faster and he began shooting first. Jesse Jr. shot all of the adults in the living room. Then he felt he needed to, quote, get rid of the kids because they were witnesses. So he grabbed the knives from the drawer and the board from the house and went after them. So as detectives begin to ask more specific questions about this crime, now that he has confessed to it, Jesse Jr. lawyers up. And he also asked to speak to his mother, Priscilla Shaw. And investigators felt like this is okay. Like maybe we can get more out of him if we allow him to speak to her. So they went to the safe house the next morning to pick up Priscilla. And she went in to talk to Jesse Jr. They were alone. And she asked if the police were framing him. And he told her, quote, I did it. Priscilla asked why the babies, and Jesse went on to explain the fight that he had mentioned to investigators with Cecil Sr. And Priscilla asked if Cecil Sr. had pointed a gun at Jesse, and he said that Cecil Sr. was just waving it around while talking. He then said that Cecil Sr. set the gun down and that's when Jesse Jr. began to shoot. Then, after the murders and the attacks on the children, Jesse Jr. left the home on CJ's bike and went to his girlfriend's apartment where he had an argument with his girlfriend's daughter. As he had mentioned in the initial interview, And then Priscilla asked again, why the kids? And he said that they saw him. And she asked, why the 4-month-old baby? And he just sat in front of her and shook his head. Priscilla then got up, told her son that she loved him, and left the room. After this, Jesse Jr. was not much help to the investigation. He ended up recanting his confessions. And when his girlfriend went to go visit him, she asked him why he wasn't helping with this investigation if he's claiming he's innocent. And he told her, quote, "They got to figure it out." And I think they did. I think they did figure it out. And I think they did a pretty good job of presenting this at trial. And he was charged with 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder and 6 counts of first-degree murder when his case went to trial in 2010. Prosecutors explained that Jesse Jr. had some animosity towards his family members because they didn't visit him while he was previously incarcerated for the other murder conviction. So when he was basically holding a grudge against his family for not standing by his side after he was convicted of murder and stealing $20 off of the person he had just murdered. So once he was released from prison and then subsequently ended up getting into the fight with his brother's girlfriend and their 2 friends, he made the decision to just kill them all. And I watched an interview with CJ, um, which was a bit of a hard watch because you can tell he's so clearly affected by it. I think this interview was not that long ago. He was late teen years, I think. I don't quite remember exactly how old he was, but um, he had talked about how he had heard rumors that Jesse Jr. was angry in prison at his family for not supporting him and not visiting him frequently. And apparently these rumors were saying that while he was in prison, he was saying that he was going to kill his family when he got out. Um, so I don't really know how accurate those rumors are. I could understand how something like that might spread after the fact, but it's also entirely possible that that's all true. We don't really know. But Jesse Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to the death penalty for the 6 murders, with an additional 40 years for each attempted murder charge, totaling 120 years plus the death penalty. And in early 2024, Jesse Jr. attempted to appeal his case, claiming that his conviction of the death penalty was unconstitutional because of, quote, improper police tactics, prosecutorial misconduct, suppressed exculpatory evidence, false testimony, a false confession, and constitutionally ineffective assistance of counsel, and that he was innocent. According to the court filings, he suffered from quote lives with neurocognitive defects. Um, Not much explanation with what the cause is there and how these defects might affect him, but they said that there's no way he could have committed these 6 murders and 3 attempted murders without leaving any DNA behind. And honestly, I think he's probably right. But I also think that his DNA would certainly be in the home, and it might not be on the dismantled knives that he left behind because that could have made it easier for him to wipe down and clean, and part of the reason they were dismantled. Um, but with the time that he spent in his home, being that it was his brother's home, he was invited there that afternoon to watch the basketball game. His DNA is in that home. So, unless the DNA was found in something directly related to the crime, it's not worth the prosecution to even bring it up in court because that's such a simple explanation and defense on his side of things that unless there was that very concrete evidence, or they found the guns in his possession with DNA, something like that, um, it's understandable why DNA was not brought forward. But I will say, DNA is something that's very important to a lot of these cases. And if you have the opportunity to bring up that argument, I understand why he did. Although I think that there's other evidence beyond the DNA that has convicted him. But he adds that investigators had a lot of pressure to solve the case because it was one of the worst mass murders in Memphis history. And A&E's TV show 48 Hours did an episode on the murders. And that police really just wanted to get an arrest quickly because of this TV show pressure and just the public pressure being such a brutal murder, that they had also violated his Miranda rights in this kind of push to get an arrest. And according to the court documents I've seen, I don't think that there's evidence to support this, but it's also what's on paper versus what potentially really happened. I don't know. But he's claiming that these murders were still gang related and retaliation from the gangster disciples. And that's kind of where he's still attempting to lead investigators. And he's saying that the gangster disciples had put out a total blackout order. And as I said earlier, I know very little about gangs beyond what's in pop culture and the news. And I know that is a tiny fraction of what happens within gangs, both good and bad. And if what I know is at all correct, a total blackout order would be one of the most extreme punishments for crossing a gang, for in this case, stealing money and ratting on somebody for having some drugs. Obviously, I don't know any of the specifics, especially when it comes to the incident with the drugs. Who knows if this guy had a whole pharmacy in his home or a bag of weed. I don't know. But I think in either situation of those, on either extreme, calling a total blackout order is so incredibly extreme, especially knowing how many victims were in that house, how many children lived in that home. That seems like an incredibly extreme order by the gangster disciples to do so for ratting out one gang member. And then when we consider the money scenario and the stolen money, if you kill him and you kill everybody that he knows, his family, his friends, you're not getting your money back. And I think that's a pretty common knowledge thing for a lot of people, at least a lot of people who are kind of in this crime world where we listen to a lot of this, we read a lot of crime. If you kill the person you're trying to get money from, you're never getting your money. But the next part of the appeal, I think, kind of gives him a little tiny bit of a leg to stand on, at least in the first part. He says that CJ's memory is unreliable due to his injuries and the medication he was on at the time that he had identified Jesse Jr. as the murderer. But this is where it gets a little more outlandish, in my opinion. He then continues to go on and say that investigators were bribing CJ, offering him gifts for identifying Jesse Jr. as the murderer, and that between the medication and the supposed gifts, investigators had, quote, tampered with CJ's memory. So I don't really buy that as much. Do I think that there is the possibility that he has had brain injuries that could have affected his memory? Yeah, I do. But those specifics of investigators attempting to bribe him and that they're tampering with his memory in that way, I don't believe so. But from this appeal, this was filed in January of 2024. I haven't seen any updates. I don't know what's happening with it. But currently, Jesse Jr. is still in prison on death row for murdering 4 adults and 2 children and attempting to murder 3 additional children. So we'll see what happens in the future. I personally have the feeling that nothing is going to happen, that he is going to stay in prison, stay on death row. But we'll just kind of have to see from here. But that is all that I have for you today. Thank you for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and you can follow our show on Spotify and leave us a review there. You can find us on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, and on TikTok at HYHATC. You can also email me at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.